Um, yeah, okay. So, bird's eye view of theosophical practice or applied theosophy or whatnot. We're going to give that, and we'll start off with a little bit of context, and then we kind of have an idea of the main points we want to try to hit. It's always tough to do a bird's eye view because you could talk about the whole thing for 20 hours and not exhaust it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, so I thought what we'd do here is I have a couple notes here for context, and I thought I'd introduce each idea, and then maybe you can say something about each idea. So maybe we can kind of start off that way. We'll see how it goes. See if we can
Okay.
cover those points. So the first one I was thinking is, in order to understand why a system might promote certain kinds of practices or certain virtues or whatnot, you kind of have to have context for the overall worldview. And there's one thing that Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine that you and I've talked about before that I think is really valuable is she specifically defines theosophical philosophy as objective idealism. And so if you start to understand sort of what objective idealism means, then you get a bit of a baseline for the ideas that come later and the practices that why you would engage in certain kinds of practices or have a certain view of the path and stuff like that. So yeah, do you want to touch on objective idealism a little bit?
Yeah, sure. We keep it short because it's a bird's eye view, and we discussed it before. But especially in theosophy, it's always good to repeat something.
Exactly.
And so, um, you can point out that it is sort of the middle ground between materialism and subjective idealism. And of course, with materialism, there's not much to discuss there in terms of ethics because ultimately we all die and it's over and done with. There's no need for any kind of idealism, actually, except for if you're a humanist. I mean, I totally respect those people, but we all die. And if we don't know what goes on afterwards, or what is there a kind of goal that we're heading for, then you can just drop materialism altogether, of course. And it's basically the same for subjective idealism because in materialism, you could say abstractions are like, yeah, well, whatever. But in subjective materialism, the abstractions are mental. They do not have their own reality except in the mind, as they say. Whereas theosophy takes the perspective of objective idealism in the sense that those abstractions have a reality on their own plane. But then, of course, you have to admit that there are more planes. But that's not a big jump. We all fall asleep and are on another plane. You could, if you want to call that a plane, the dream plane. And there's the dream state too, another plane. But from a subjective idealistic perspective, that's just all in the mind because we don't know what's going on really, especially not in deep sleep. So I think that's a very important distinction to make, that there are substances that we do not meet with on a physical plane. And then for the rest, yeah, okay, it's all just in the mind. No, it's a reality. There are substances that are a lot more ethereal in nature, maybe even beyond what quantum physics is investigating, because that's still a relatively material perspective. And hats off for what they are able to accomplish that. But in theosophy, well, there's an infinite range of substance,
Mhm.
even up to the point where you could say, well, it's not nothing, because nothing doesn't exist, obviously, but it's a no thing. But it's also a relative thing because for entities that would be able to perceive the no thing, and it's a bit of an odd expression, but whatever, what else can we use? To them, it's still a reality, no matter how high on the plane you go.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the really valuable ways that Blavatsky phrases it is that like whatever plane or state of consciousness one is operating through or on, that is the reality for that being. And it is real. It's not just that. And that's sort of like you could contrast pure materialism with like a very like simple form of Advaita Vedanta where it's like everything's a dream, right? So you just got to wake up from the dream. But Theosophy wouldn't take either of those extremes, which is important for theosophical ethics and practice because you're not just trying to wake up. It's not that simple. So you don't have the sort of like, in like Zen Buddhism or some schools where they have that idea of like instant awakening or instant enlightenment. You can just one day somebody woke up and they became enlightened. And Theosophy always has a bit of a pushback on that to say no. It's more of a gradual enlightenment kind of process, right? It's evolutionary, not instant. Yeah.
Well,
So
there is something to say for it that the moment it happens, it's instant, of course. But how did you run up to that point? There had to be a lot of preparation that maybe you may have forgotten, and all of a sudden, karmically, something kicks in. Yeah, then it's sudden, but it's not sudden in the long run.
yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah. So
and
there's
another thing with regard to dreams, we may have mentioned that before too. If you need to see something on this plane, you need an external light source, the sun, electric light, a candle, whatever. But you see things in your mind, you could say, when you sleep. Well, if it would be a pure abstraction, it wouldn't exist.
Mhm.
It has to be a substance that we are not so familiar with, which in Theosophy is referred to, by the way, as an astral substance, and that also has like infinite degrees in essence.
Exactly. So, okay, so there's a bit of a foundation where Theosophy kind of has this middle road between materialism and idealism. And then one other thing that you touched on right at the beginning that factors in is that Theosophy is an emanational system, which includes a doctrine of evolution, but it differs from material evolution in the sense that it's the technical term is teleological. So it has a goal. There's an idea in Theosophy that there's an ultimate end aim of evolution. So can you
Purpose.
maybe, yeah, exactly. Can you address that a little bit of like how that fits into the context of the theosophical worldview and what is that goal? Like how do we define what that goal is?
Yeah. Well, like you said, if you contrast it with modern science, evolution is ultimately aimless. There is no intelligence behind it. And of course, we mentioned that too, that they're afraid of going back to some kind of an entity that started everything off and rules everything or has something to say about it. And that's, of course, not the perspective in Theosophy. The the that you could say there is two types of goals, and that sounds a bit odd. There is the goal of always moving further, because in essence, once you start talking about an absolute, if you take that in the absolute sense, there is no reaching it because evolution will never stop. Imagine it would stop, and then what? We're going to be bored for the rest of infinite time or something, which is a ridiculous concept, of course. It's the same as saying, yeah, maybe space has an end. Yeah, well, what's at that end then? A wall that takes up space? And how thick is it? And is there something behind the wall? So the same applies to a goal. So there is that one goal that is ultimately unreachable, like the horizon always receding. But there is also a goal that is relative to you could say, the cycle of evolution that you go through, the summum bonum of the system in which you evolve. And according to Theosophy, life is everywhere in the cosmos, but we may not recognize it as so. But they will also be subject to cycles, and they will also have their own goals, whatever that may represent on their own level. So yeah, there is a summum bonum to be reached, and sometimes also referred to as absolute. But that doesn't give you two absolutes there, because there is an end to reaching the ultimate of experience you can suck out of an evolution. But
That's a
then
great way of
what
phrasing it.
afterwards? Yeah, according to Theosophy, well, yeah, then there is a very long stretch of rest. But that is rest relative to your evolution. what actually goes on that is beyond our pay grade. You can call it nirvana or whatever you want to call it, but but when that rest stops, then a new evolution on a higher plane will take place. And there we have to be careful, because I've heard a lot of people referring to the snake biting its own tail. Oh yeah, we're just running in circles. No, it doesn't really bite its own tail, in the sense that when you reach the end, the snake starts again on a higher plane. So it's more like a spiral or helicoidal, like a screw form. And it goes on ad infinitum. Never had a beginning, will never have an end. Because if you pose an end or a beginning, you got a problem. But there are beginnings and ends in terms of cycles, of course. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. And that whole concept of a progressive cyclical evolution is like, that's the context, like one of the fundamental points of context for all theosophical practice, right? Because there's some systems that will, one of the things that we can say about theosophy is, in a certain sense, it's a mystical system, right? But it's not quite the same as other mystical systems that are a little bit more simplified in their version of the absolute. So they'll a lot of mystical systems will look at it like, well, they posit some basic ideas, like there's an ultimate reality, and that ultimate reality can be experienced, and there's a path or inner work or something to get there, right? So it's kind of like, that's how it works. And that's true in theosophy, but not in an absolute sense. It's not that there's an absolute reality that you reach and then that's the end of it's all over at that point. There's this idea of like cyclical evolution. So in any given cycle you're in, the goal that you're aiming for is actually has to do with your own development that is reached by the end of that cycle, so to speak. And maybe you can touch on that just quickly, of like, one of the things HBB talks about is that self-analyzing consciousness, or the kind of self-consciousness that can be arrived at before the end of a big cycle, so that in that quote unquote rest period, there's something or more active consciousness that can occur. So it's sort of a relative goal there, right?
Yeah, and that is what she's actually referring as absolute consciousness. But absolute consciousness is not the absolute. It is the reaching of that summum bonum with respect to your past experience. I mean, you can incorporate in an summum bonum something that you never have experienced. And of course, even that relative limit that you reach there, like I said before, it will continue after a time of rest. But in itself, it's not all about you, because those who teach us these subjects, they're what we refer to as Mahatmas, to which we come later, they say themselves that when you reach that absolute consciousness, that has to include the experience of all other beings, in a certain sense. How far we have to expand that? Well, the details are rather scarce there, but it is said that the human experience in its totality of humanity need to be reached by every individual. Whether that's going to be in the same cycle or not, that's another discussion, of course. Because you could say, well, what happens to those who don't reach it? Well, they continue, but obviously at a lower level than those who have reached it. And those
Mm-hmm.
who have reached it will not move further on until they have helped those behind them come to the same point. But at some time, a cycle finishes, whether you're ready or not. So
That's a good way of
that's a
putting it.
that's
Yeah,
an
exactly. So there's
important
a
point.
bit of, like, you could say, a bit of sort of collectivism in the ethical view in theosophy, right? So it's like, you're not just, and this applies to certain types of esoteric Buddhism have very similar approaches as well, where you say, okay, an individual can go into nirvana, let's just call it that, right? Reach a higher state, or the end, the state that represents the end goal of a cycle. An individual can reach that, but that in a sense is sort of incomplete. Like it's that individual will then have to come back out of that state at some point in a future cycle and continue on with their work too. So it's not a finality, and it's incomplete because you're not an isolated, separate individual from other individuals. So if the collective isn't arriving at the end goal, then in a certain sense you kind of failed if you just leave everybody behind. And that
Yeah.
informs a
Well,
lot of
yeah,
theosophical practice too, right?
yeah. That's exactly the point, because people could you could bring up the criticism, yeah, but when you reach that absolute knowledge, how can you say that it includes the experience of all other people because you haven't experienced that? Yes, you have, because you could say all the karma that we experience goes for everybody, not necessarily in this life, but at some point in the future, we will all have gone primarily through the same experiences. How we experience that may be different, but it's ultimately, I mean, everybody has to pay taxes, everybody dies, and you can reduce that to individual elements that happen in your individual life, but sooner or later, we're all going to have to deal with the same fundamental problems. We just experience them slightly different. And that is actually what is meant by realizing the experience of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Not how they did it, but the experience itself, because we all go through the same experiences
Yeah, and that kind of
over
goes
time.
to, yeah, exactly. And that kind of goes to the nature of self, because one of the things in if you contrast sort of the theosophical mysticism with other forms of mysticism, in theosophy there's like a transformation of self from like separate individual to kind of a collective identity, still an individual self, but a kind of collective. So there's a bit of a shift in how we view the self that is reaching that state as not the same as this personal self. So there's a bit of a shift there, which obviously, like in a bird's eye view, you can't go into too much depth on that, but that informs the practice as well, right?
Well, in the theosophical teaching, we pose something that is like, with a Sanskrit term, referred to as Mahat. In its unmanifested aspect, we refer to it as universal mind. In its manifested aspect, we call it the cosmic mind because it becomes relative to a system in which you evolve. That cosmic mind is the sum total of humanity. And from there on, when differentiation takes place, each one of our self consciousnesses is a direct ray, or I wouldn't say perhaps direct, but is an emanated ray from that source that we refer to as the cosmic mind, which has its essence in a universal mind.
Mm-hmm. So there's a
So there are, yeah,
universalizing of the self. Yeah, there's a
yeah.
universalizing of identity and all
So
that.
in essence, we are all one. And you could say essentially the same, functionally different. And I think that's a beautiful expression which you can apply to 5,000 other things.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple of things that tie into everything we've brought up so far, which is because we're seeing this idea of like a progressive cyclical evolution, a kind of spiralitic evolution that has end goals at the end of each given cycle. There's a couple ideas that come out here that are different than modern views on evolution, and one is in the modern view of evolution, which restrains itself to just what we can see and feel on Earth. Humans are considered to be the apex of evolution. We're at the head of the evolutionary wave, so to speak. But in theosophy, that's not the case. In theosophy, the view is that we are a unit, a unified family, so to speak, as humanity, among many other collectives of individuals, many other waves of individuals going through evolution on in the Earth system, in other systems in our solar system, and so on and so on. So humans aren't viewed as the end, as the highest evolution. So there's naturally the idea that there's those who are ahead of
Yeah.
us, and that also informs how
Yeah.
we look at theosophical practice, right? And you
I
touched on that earlier
remember
with
it.
Mahatmas.
Yeah. I remember HPB making a comment in her Secret Doctrine where she refers to humanity as the head of the subnatural evolution. What a statement. Because actually, evolution, in terms of being able to act from your own choice and willpower, and those are all have different connotations, of course, that is where evolution actually starts, by reaching self-consciousness. How we come to that point, well, yeah, we can make 50 podcasts probably about that subject, but that is essentially the idea in theosophy, that vehicles are developed in which the vehicle at some point reaches such a complexity that that self-consciousness can be induced, so to speak. But we're actually inducing it to ourselves in a certain sense, which is also a difficult subject, but we will also discuss that later. And then evolution starts, and then the question is, okay, where is it going? And of course, there is a variety of terms, because it's not that after humanity you reach the highest possible. There is a whole range of development. And if you want to use a Christian term, well, even in Christianity, they have angels. They're not God yet, but they're higher than humanity. So, and then what comes after the angels? Well, then come the gods, and who knows what comes after that. So, in that sense, you have to take the position that within the human evolution itself, it's referred to as the human life wave on our Earth, whether you call it planetary chain or just one globe. And that human life wave, well, there are people in the realm that we know that are absolute geniuses. But there's also a bunch of people that you can really call clowns, pardon the expression, but that's how they live, like clowns or criminals. So there's this whole range. Now, the genius element is what borders on the angelic level, if you would be able to add to that genius element a perfect ethical approach to the subjects that we're experiencing. And then you reach that level where we start speaking of adepts and Mahatmas. And of course, HPB often uses also adeptship or adepts for Mahatmas, but we have to keep in mind all Mahatmas are adepts, but not all adepts are Mahatmas. And then is there a stage beyond Mahatmaship? Yeah, maybe you can refer to that as Nirmanakaya. And it seems, I wouldn't nail it down, but it seems that all Nirmanakayas are Mahatmas, but not all Mahatmas may be Nirmanakayas yet. And yeah, evolution is infinite. At some point, you reach, with respect to the mind, what we can understand, you reach a limit, but there may still something beyond that.
Yeah, that's a perfect overview, because basically what we get down to is that we can imagine that evolution in any given system is going to have a kind of bell curve to it. So there's going to be those at the lead end, and there's going to be the bulk in the middle, and there's going to be those trailing behind. And there's something to say for that in theosophical evolution. And so there is going to be those who are ahead of us. Do we really know much about them? Probably not. Little snippets here and there. The different religious traditions have different things to say. Theosophy has some things to say about, what the nature of a Mahatma or Nirmanakaya or these other terms might represent. But the bottom line is that there's those ahead. And one of the foundational things in theosophy is that there are those who are ahead who are still engaged with humanity, with our humanity, like the objectively incarnated humanity that we know is guided and aided and helped on by those who are ahead of us. And that comes up in a bunch of different religious systems, and theosophy might just be a bit more particular in how it talks about that.
Yeah. And all of these stages also have their subdivisions, of course. I mean, like we said, if you look at humanity, that goes from the least developed human being on earth to a genius level of human existence. The same is true for adepts. The same is true for Mahatmas. The same is true even for Nirmanakayas. We can go into that later because that would take us a little bit too deep into that. But there are distinctions among Nirmanakayas too. If not, if they have reached omniscience, you would have enough on one Nirmanakaya, right? Why are there multiple ones?
Yeah,
And what is
exactly.
beyond that? So yeah.
Yeah, and it's no different than just identifying, like, in any given scientific discipline, there's going to be those at the lead end of it, and there's going to be those trailing behind in any endeavor. So why wouldn't that apply to angels or Mahatmas or whatever other words we want to use for those who are ahead of
Yeah.
us? Okay, so one
Well,
other thing.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
Some academics we call scientists. Well, some are doing just low-level work in a lab, repetitive work, and other are on the level of what you can call theoretical physicists or something. You know,
Mhm.
so you see those ranges everywhere. It's not that Theosophy is sucking it out of its thumb.
Yeah,
So
exactly. In a sense, a lot of what Theosophy puts forward, when you really think it through, becomes sort of self-evident realities. It's like, okay, that would make sense that that's the case. Okay, so one other thing in Theosophy that we can tie in before we get into like more particulars on practice is, um, one of the ways that Theosophy differs from some mystical systems is that, a good deal of mystical systems, including like Advaita Vedanta and many schools of Buddhism and such, is that Theosophy isn't solely concerned with that kind of omniscient awakening or enlightenment or whatever other words we want to attach to it. Some of those systems will say, okay, all that matters is nirvana, all that matters is moksha, or whatever other terms we want to use for it, right? For that kind of like liberation or enlightenment. Theosophy says, yes, that's part of the path, that's part of the initiatory or occult path, but the philosophical, rational, metaphysical type of knowledge plays a very important role. And so Theosophy also grounds its practices and its ethics in that metaphysical exploration, in the philosophical exploration. It doesn't throw that out like some mystical systems do, where they say, "Well, you just got to wake up from the dream." Well, Theosophy says, "No, this stuff is real. It's objective idealism. Therefore, there's something to learn from it." And I
uh-huh.
wonder if you could just touch on that quickly, and maybe one way to touch on it is those two terms that we have in the Voice of the Silence of Tattva Jnani and Atma Jnani.
Yeah. In in a certain sense, you could even refer to scientists who investigate primarily the material concerns of the world. You can also call them a tattvajnani, but their investigations within that realm of tattvajnani is primarily concerned with objective things. That doesn't mean that metaphysics is not used in science. Of course, they use it, but they don't see it as a tool per se. It's again that subjective idealism, basically. But for Theosophy, it's a reality, the metaphysical world, and so there's two elements that you can investigate. That is the consciousness side of existence and the material side of existence. Science is primarily concerned with the material side, even though in the last 20 years there's an enormous interest all of a sudden in what is consciousness. Is it primal, or how do we look upon it? Whereas in Theosophy, those two paths are actually one, essentially. But what that is, that non-dual reality, that's not part of our world yet, except for those yogis who reach up to that level, of course. So HVV says, at some point, our world is made up of all kinds of substances. What you need to do in order to reach that level of unity is to transcend the influence of any material or substantial taint. And that is what is referred to as the Atma Jnani, the total identification, not only with consciousness, but with its counterpart, which is essentially one. You can say Purusha slash Prakriti, Parabrahm slash Mula Prakriti. It is essentially one. And sometimes that is indeed, like we said before, referred to as absolute, but that's the absolute knowledge, not the absolute that always recedes, or there would be no evolution anymore.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So there's a value in Theosophy, and it is put in a fairly prominent place in Blavatsky's writings. There's a value to metaphysical exploration. There's a value to philosophical exploration. So there's all these doctrines in Theosophy that kind of give you a bit of a conceptual framework or understanding of kind of the layout of the land. It's like the structure of a universal system, the structure of the system that we're in. And I always like to think of that in the way we differ a little bit from some mystical schools, is that there's some mystical schools where it's just you just got to wake up from the dream. So you just got to focus inwardly and you'll wake up from the dream, right? There's certain very,
Easier
very
said than
basic.
done.
And in Theosophy, we have this idea where you could phrase it kind of like this, like, okay, there's a goal to arrive at that is that kind of, relative omniscience to a system, but there's a path to get there. And if you don't know that path, you're not going to get there. So we need sort of a roadmap or a trail map. So you can wander through the woods all you want, and you might just wander in circles for years and years and years. But if you have a map that shows you where the goal is and a general idea of how to get there, then that informs all of your other practice. So that map lies at the basis of your meditation or whatever other practices you're doing, right?
Well, there is a point where actually the scientific investigation and the theosophical meet, because science is primarily based on sense knowledge, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling. But they also go into there is like in mathematics, for instance, the rational investigation and application of things. But we say it doesn't stop there. There is a step beyond that, which we can call the intuitive approach. But that requires a certain education, a training to come to that. So you could almost say ultimately all scientists need to become yogis in that sense. But at present, that's a little bit asking too much. But maybe in a distant future, that's maybe where they go. And what's the difference? Even the rational mind that has primarily its input from sensory perception, even that rational mind is cause-effect based. So you investigate something, you keep on going, you set a cause in motion, and you come up with an end result. But Theosophy says there is an intuitive approach where subject and object are non-existent anymore, or are one, if you like. But that requires a particular path, and you mentioned that word, initiation. So in that sense, what is an initiation as distinct from a rational investigation? Because you could say the most important important moment in your life is the next one. That's the most
Yeah.
important in your life. So what do you do with that? And of course, we almost relentlessly come to new insights. If you're using even your rational mind a little bit, isn't that an initiation? You are initiated in something you didn't realize, or you're liberated from ignorance, and you become more aware of something. But there are certain stages that you cannot go beyond without an input from something higher.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us then back to Mahatmas and initiation and et cetera, of course.
Exactly. And we could bring a real world view to that too, which I know you've brought up before with one example of, if you're going to go to university, you need a teacher. There's certain things that you're not going to really crack through on your own. And that goes back to the whole just old school version of master and disciple, or master and apprentice is a good way to think of it too. Like at a certain point, you're going to need maybe a helping hand. And so there's maybe specific types of initiation that are aided or guided. And you have that in all the different traditions too. I mean, you have that in Christianity. You have all kinds of, like, even the original idea of baptism in Christianity. We could make a direct parallel line between that and the way Theosophy talks about initiation, right? What was the baptism of Jesus? There's a way of looking at that connects it in with initiation. So yeah, we should get into that a little bit. One of the things I was thinking, just we'll go on to initiation, Mahatmas, Chelas, all these things will go into that. One of the ways that we can kind of lay out the theosophical practice idea then is that the ethics is placed primary. It's of utmost importance in theosophy. So there's that quote you wanted to bring in, that quote before of live the life and live the life necessary.
Yeah.
Maybe just touch on that
Yeah,
really quickly.
HBB refers to that in the Secret Doctrine. And it's basically the idea, she says, lead the life necessary for the acquisition of this knowledge. And knowledge will be almost literally given to you. But we need to prepare the soil in
Mhm.
order to get to that point. And of course, the subject of teacher and pupil, it's a universal subject that you find everywhere. And it extends beyond the sensory perception. So in order to get there, you need also a teacher. And those teachers are pupils to, again, higher teachers. And by the way, that whole system is referred to as the Guru Parampara chain. So every pupil is, in his own right, able to teach people who know less, and the teacher becomes a pupil to a higher developed teacher. And that line also runs into ad infinitum, of course.
Yeah, which just that just ties right in with the idea of that cyclical evolution. There's a whole chain of beings in engaging in evolution together. So we have ethics as a really primary thing, and then in theosophy we also have study as a really primary thing. And you'll find that a lot in, if you go hang out with theosophists, you'll find that study plays a prominent role in most theosophists' practice of theosophy. And we have a term Jnana yoga, which is the knowledge knowledge yoga, which there's a certain way of understanding what that is, but it kind of ties in with what you said about cultivating intuition. There's a way of studying and stuff. We'll get to that in a minute. We have ethics, we have study, and then we have that the path, and in a certain sense, the path becomes sort of its own topic. That has to do with initiation and master disciple relationships and all these things. So maybe we can just kind of start onto that a little bit and lay the groundwork a little of what that looks like. There's a bunch of terms in theosophy. There's Mahatma and Adept. There's initiate. There's Chela, which is synonymous term with disciple, you could say. But do you want to just give us maybe a starting point kind of overview of how theosophy looks at these different terms and the master disciple
Yeah.
kind of relationship?
Of course, for people who are critical, especially scientists, with regard to imagine that there would be something smarter in the universe than us. Well, yeah, they are. And they are still part of humanity as well. It's not that they're separated from it, but we refer to those distinctions of like genius humanity. But then there's the angelic level, and there's other words for it in theosophy, the anchoans, and you name it. It's a general term for those entities that have progressed beyond the human stage, but they have their source in humanity as well. And like we said, how far that reaches, we don't know. But if you use the word adept, it comes from the Latin adeptus. It simply means being proficient at something. And that actually corresponds to that idea of the tattva jnani, because also the yogi needs to know what matter is, and perhaps in a certain sense, even more than than consciousness, because consciousness in essence just is. There's not much to investigate about it, because you can only investigate things that are of a substantial nature. So the more ethereal the vehicle becomes, the better that essential consciousness can work through it. So the Tattvajnani also investigates matter, substance, but goes way beyond the range that includes psychology, the mind, etc., the spiritual levels of existence. And so that goes way beyond the investigations of what is possible in a purely materialistic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how far
Yeah,
does that
exactly.
reach?
Yeah, and that's the thing,
Okay.
because when we talk about exploring substance in theosophy, we're not just talking about the physical matter that we know. And so obviously our society is quite good at exploring physical substance now. I mean, look at the technology that these geniuses are able to create out of a knowledge of this substance. But when we talk about knowing or investigating substance in theosophy, we're talking about also substances on different planes, different higher planes, which we generally refer to as astral substance or akashic substance, and so on, right?
Yeah. I
So
think
the investigation
it's
is larger.
yeah. It's probably good to just point out the distinction here. When do we use the word matter? When do we use the word substance? Or when do we use the word energy or force? And keep in mind that these elements are always relative to each other, because Blavatsky points out in The Secret Doctrine, it's on page 329 in volume 1, where she says, matter is actually nothing but the perception of something itself. And that perception is limited by the capacity or the range of our sensory instruments. But she says once you go beyond that, we refer to it as substance, which is the noumenon of matter. But of course, now we know that scientists have basically come to the conclusion that matter per se doesn't exist, and they're right on there. But now they push it further, and they speak then more of energy. Well, we totally agree with whether you would like to call it substance or energy. It's essentially the same thing. But there is something beyond that energy, and that is consciousness then. They're not there yet, but at least they have their foot in the door. And that may take centuries to investigate for them, of course.
For sure, because the scientific method is slow and grueling in that
Yeah.
sense, right?
And,
So,
and keep in mind that the investigation is only possible because of consciousness.
which
So,
turns it on its head and hard to
yeah,
investigate
yeah, of
empirically or
course.
objectively.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a couple things in relation to we've touched on the idea of there being beings who belong to humanity but are ahead of us. For us, the path that Theosophy lays out, there's a term chela that you'll find throughout theosophical literature. Can you give us a little overview of what that idea represents, what that idea is?
Yeah, just like you could say, in terms of teachers, there's also an enormous level of gradations. So also in pupils, there's a level of gradations. In I think it's Sanskrit, right?
Mhm.
Chela.
Chela.
So that stands for pupil or somebody who learns. But with regard to the specific use of that of that term chela, at some point, the somebody has to start realizing that they are pupils because they want to learn about the world. And I mean here not only the physical world, but in its most broad perspective. So you can do that, like scientists have done that, and they're still learning as well. So they're still pupils in a certain sense. But at some point, you will come to a level where you can't penetrate any further. And then you need a teacher that is beyond the level of what we would call academic science and understanding. And that's what we refer to as those Mahatmas, literally great souls. And so the pupil, as he comes closer and closer to that level of where there is a need for such a teacher, they first have to prepare the soil. And that's usually on your own. That, of course, and we do that through study and ethical applications, because that's an important element. Why ethics? Why can you do it just on the basis of mind alone? Well, no, ethics is necessary because our ethical behavior sets up barriers on an inner level that we're not aware of, that prevents us from going further than our personal investigations. So there is an absolute requisite that in the preparation, the purity of our inner world needs to reach a certain level where a contact with such high level teachers becomes possible. And then you have gradations. You can become, first you become just, you can call yourself a pupil or a chela. Then you become a chela on probation. That's something that HPB refer to in the beginning of the theosophical movement in society. And then eventually, so the preparation of the ground becomes more and more intense, you could say. You need to reach a certain level of also ethical purification. The next step up is where you become an accepted chela. And the information there becomes a little bit, wishy-washy. Some things have been said about that, and you can look them up. But it becomes then a very individual path. And that path is also part of the antascaronic path that we're referring to, which are actually stages of adeptship. The moment you become an accepted chela, you become an adept. But then there are, HPB says there are 7 levels of adeptship. And that corresponds with that antascaronic path, which are referred to as the transcendental virtues, the paramitas. And that's the path that everybody needs to walk. Even though Krishna says, whatever path you take, it will ultimately lead to me. Yeah, but that me is the beginning of that antascaronic path. And of course, it's still going to be individual too. Everybody walks the same path, but the how will depend on you could say, your physical, psychological, mental, and spiritual makeup.
Mm-hmm. And your karma, which will
Yeah,
come in
yeah.
and
But the
have the
hurdles,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the hurdles will be the same for everybody. How you take them, that's up to you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that brings us to a really good point because, one of the things that you have what Blavatsky had to say about Chelaship, initiation, and the path, and she would often use the term occult, right? So occult path, which just means secret or hidden, and
Hidden.
that's one of the things you butt up against in this part of theosophical practices. There's something in initiation and Chelaship that is intensely private and secret. And so there really isn't there's a certain point in your investigation of theosophical practice where you'll hit an end point. You'll hit a wall where there's just not much more said about the nature of certain initiations, the nature of what the chela is actually doing, what the Mahatma or the teacher is doing with the chela. There's just hints here and there, uh, little points that are touched on, but there's not an overall. This is exactly what Chelaship is. These are all the different initiations. Now there were theosophists that came after Blavatsky that tried to fill all that in and say, well, here's all the details of all the initiations and all the stuff. Now we're kind of sticking to Blavatsky here because those other people, maybe the authority is a little more questionable with some of them. So we do have this path that, from our vantage point, fades off into obscurity because we can't really, in a certain sense, she says in a few places, you can't really know what initiation is until you're initiated. So there is something, a mystery there, let's say.
Yeah.
And theosophy will focus heavily on the preliminaries, we could say, from where we currently are to that point. There's all kinds of practices, like you said, of tilling the soil. And that's where the vast majority of theosophical practice is focused.
Yeah. Of course, some people might say, well, yeah, but isn't it detailed in the voice of the silence, for instance? Oh, yeah. How detailed something is, that will depend on your perception. But if you really take a good look at that book, and you may be studying it for years, you come to the understanding that it is not as simple as what is being said, because you still need to do it. And there are probably a lot of details. HVB herself says, look, I have given you 3 fragments out of 39 that I know by heart. Do those 3 fragments immediately follow each other? Are there gaps in between? And ultimately, all those three fragments are also one. It's just one fragment. So even that is still a bird's eye view. And I doubt very much that apart from it being a preparatory stage in a certain sense, that a lot of details are missing for us at our present state of evolution to really take on that path. But just like everything else in theosophy is a kind of an abstract formula, of course you can practice to the extent that you are able to, you can practice those paramitic or virtues in your daily life to the extent that you can. But there are things that are not being said, which is clear that, you know, you have to prepare the field yourself, and then basically you even have to wonder, am I ready to be ready for that? You know, there are people that might say, oh, well, if they know so much, why don't they tell us? Well, it's one thing being told, it's another one doing it, what they're
Yeah.
asking you to do to reach that level. And so, like I said, it's the knowledge itself, it's not enough. It's also our behavior and attitudes that need to live up to the quality of where you are aiming for.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good point to go from there to sort of some of the details on what all those preliminaries is. So we have a bit more with all the discussion we've had so far. There's hopefully some more context in that supports theosophical practice or supports the idea of why we would promote certain kinds of practices. So if we take it down to the base level and we say, where's the starting point? The starting point in theosophy is
The
always
next,
the
the next
core ethic.
moment,
Yeah, the next
the
moment.
next moment.
There's the core ethic, and the core ethic in theosophy is phrased a few different ways. Universal brotherhood is the way in which that ethic is primarily presented. You could use the word unity, solidarity, but you can also then bring in the word altruism, which theosophy or HPB says in a couple places about the nature of altruism, that is theosophy. Theosophy is altruism. So the sort of the core, okay, you want to start practicing theosophy. What do? Well, there's your starting. Your starting point is brotherhood. Your starting point is altruism. And it's sort of it's at the starting point because maybe the first thing you need to start doing is like getting out of your own way. Like it's not all about you. It's not about you and
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
enlightenment. So it's about the whole. It's about humanity. So you shift your perspective, and that's a good starting point.
Yeah. HVB refers to universal brotherhood as the only dogma in theosophy. If you can run with that, there's no need to make an effort because you're stumbling over yourself, you know, because of that. It is said that universal brotherhood is a fact in nature. It's not a fact in us yet, but that fact is not on the physical level. I mean, we're warring around like crazy, like it's a hobby almost.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But the true brotherhood is obviously on a much higher level, but it is possible through study and metaphysics and apply that ethical perspective in daily life to come closer to an understanding of that fundamental unity. And you can call that Jnana yoga or whatever name you want to give it, but that's ultimately where you need to go.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say, okay, ethics is the practice and study is the theoretical. But then in the ethics has its theoretical counterpart and the practical aspect of it. And the study itself is also practice. We just think, oh,
Exactly.
yeah, study, that's just something that goes on in the mind, but it's practice. You need to practice how to study. And that requires a certain methodology or methodologies even, plural.
Yeah, exactly. That's we can move into that subject a little bit because that is an area where theosophy differs from most systems, including most Buddhist systems of practice, most Hindu systems of practice. If you take the Kabbalistic system or Christian system, Theosophy differs in the way that it talks about study, or the way that study is presented. And like you say, study is not presented as purely theoretical. It is in itself a practice. I think maybe the best way to start off with something like that is to say, well, what would be the point of the kind of study that Theosophy talks about? And I think maybe the best starting point is to say, well, it has to do with the transformation of how we think, how we engage with a subject or an object. Because our starting point is this very low level, we think of it as low level, investigation of just material, objective things. But we move from that point into deeper study where there's a transformation in how you approach things. And you kind of move from, what do you say, from intellect to intuition. There's a changing. It's like in science, you'll hear that plasticity of the mind idea, right? So like we're actually, study is what is changing the way in which your mind operates so that
Yeah.
it becomes more receptive to intuitive input, and we can begin to explore reality with higher functioning levels of mind.
Yeah, you could say fundamentally, Theosophy, at least for our present humanity, is the investigation of mind. Yeah. And that is almost an endless field, especially when you take the perspective that there are different levels or qualities of mind. And even a rational investigation, everything ultimately starts with, I think we may have brought that up before as well, with blind belief. You start with something and you got to see if it's true or not. So you got to run with it for a while. That's the blind part of it. But like Christians keep running with it forever because they're apparently not supposed to ask questions of God, so to speak. But there's no such limitation in Theosophy. So you can see the rational understanding and logical understanding of things up to a certain level. It's like climbing a mountain. But at some point, you're going to come to the top. And the only thing that you can do from there is fly. But that takeoff there, that's the intuitive element. And we see that in ourselves too, that very often we study Theosophy, we get frustrated or we come to a paradox. And then there's two things you can do. That's give up or keep pushing. But at some point, you may become so frustrated that you say, okay, I got to stop. I got to let it go. And that is actually when you reach that paradox, that's where the soil is prepared. And you can apply that to many subjects, of course. It's not that all the whole of Theosophy is going to become understandable all of a sudden. It depends on what specifics you are actually studying. So even that so when you reach that apex and you jump off, it's like lightning striking, where the soil is prepared. We have put the seeds in, and you could say the spiritual farmer comes into play, and pours the water there, pours the knowledge there, and then we can move on. But then we have to repeat that. So it's not that one intuition is going to solve our problem. Of course, it has to be repeated over and over again to ultimately where the intuitive approach becomes the full range of our existence. Of course, with regard to worldly things, you will still be able, it's not that you forget about cause and effect, you will still be able to apply that. But at some point, you reach such a high level of development that everything you approaches will be from an intuitive perspective.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to
And then
lay it out.
there is actually a little bit more to it because, when you have an intuition, that's something that comes from a higher source to your level where you have done the work, prepared the work. But it's another thing to reach up to the source where that intuition comes from. that is the yogic path of Jnana yoga, of course, and Raja yoga.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, theosophical study, it has partly to do with the content of what's being studied, but it's more the methodology. It's more the actual mental practice that is put into effect, that jnana yoga in the study. And like you said, it's a progressive. There's a really good summary of that in something which theosophists tend to refer to as the Bowen notes. It's just notes on something Blavatsky was talking about study, where your your process in study and learning is progressive in a kind of cyclical way that mirrors that larger evolutionary cycle. So you move from not knowing something to having a vision of that thing that feels quite complete to you. And then over time that vision will become a little stale. It doesn't Other things will come in that make it seem incomplete and it doesn't quite serve anymore. And then you have to kind of let that go and move on to the next. And you'll then again be kind of in a bit of a void where you don't quite know how it is. And then you move forward from there and you come up with another vision that's going to be a little better than the previous vision, a little clearer. And so there's just this ongoing progressive nature to the actual study practice in theosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. And each time that an intuition strikes, how long does it last? A fraction of a second. You don't even know the intuition. You just have that feeling, I get it. But then immediately it is conceptualized. But it is conceptualized as an answer to the work that you've put in. So
Mhm.
you receive, of course, cause-effect relationships answers, but they become at least clear on this level. And that's the distinction I make between receiving an intuition and going on up to its own level, where the perception is such that it becomes incommunicado on this level. But it is helpful for your own progress, of course.
Mhm. Yeah, and you'll find that phrased in different ways, direct perception or direct contact, with the thing in and of itself. So there is something to say about that. And that ties then into, we have this jnana yoga practice in theosophy, which is what we've been talking about with how the study is done. And then on the other side, we have in theosophy what we refer to as Raja yoga, which is where we get into more of the meditative. And that meditative is part of working on your own state of consciousness to a point where some of that direct contact can be made. And that, theosophy doesn't really invent anything new in these categories. So the yoga that we're talking about is drawn from places like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So theosophists will also follow along that same kind of pathway in meditation. And many theosophists will take on the pathway and the practices of meditation that come from Buddhist schools, because really we're all kind of working on the same idea in those meditation practices. Now, some of those systems might ignore the jnana yoga part, okay? But in terms of just the meditation practice, theosophy doesn't have a booklet or an instruction that says, here's how you meditate. What it does say is self-devised, self-induced effort. So you have to figure out your own practice, develop your own practice. And you can draw that from all these different traditions. The core of it being concentrate, the ability to develop true concentration, true meditation, which is really holding the mind to an object that is being examined. By object, I don't mean a physical thing. And then, so dharana, dhyana, samadhi in the Sanskrit. So you're aiming for samadhi in the same kind of way that you would find in Advaita Vedanta or those kind of traditions.
Yeah. And the difficulty is even such that when you say, okay, but if the study of theosophy requires a methodology, what are the methodologies? The answer would be, well, even that you have to figure out for yourself. It's not so obvious because HPB, she mentions it somewhere where she says, if you just study the secret doctrine, and it's not that you shouldn't do that, from the beginning to the end, it will only end in frustration and you're going to give up. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a moment that you read through that whole book, of course, which may take you years. But then you have to start looking at the different subjects that are discussed. And one of the most important elements in that methodology, a methodology within a methodology, is to pay particular attention to the context that in which things are being given out. And HPB can, so in other words, don't nail yourself too much down on terminology, because she may use the terminology in a different context somewhere else. Or she can refer to the context with different terminologies.
Mhm.
Or in the beginning of her Secret Doctrine, for instance, she gives a whole explanation, and you wonder, what is that doing here? Which is actually the answer to subjects in almost a question form that are brought up at the end of the Secret Doctrine. So it is not a cause-effect relationship where you have, okay, now we have this subject that we're going to discuss, a chapter on that, a chapter on this, a chapter here and there about this, and where you get a complete representation of what is being discussed. You have to figure that out for yourself.
Mhm.
And there's also that element of correspondence and analogy, two words that are used interchangeably in our daily use, but there is a specific distinction to be made between the two. An analogy is where you make a comparison where the ratios that are involved in what you're studying have a certain, you could say, what would be the word for that? That wherein the ratios are particularly determined,
Mhm.
whereas in analogy, the ratios do not always apply. That doesn't mean that there are not things that look the same. Take, for instance, our human body. We have a torso, a head, two arms, and two legs. If you look at a bird, it has a head, a torso, it has a head, two legs, but it has two wings. So you could say, well, yeah, that's sort of, the wings are like our arms, but we can fly. Birds can play piano. So that's an analogy because the ratios don't match anymore. A wing is a totally different ratio than an arm. Or think of the fins of a fish. You see the connection with a bird and with a human being, because it also has a tail. It has wings, but we call them fins. But the ratios are completely different. Whereas
Correspondence.
in a correspondence, if you say, for instance, I hit the do on a piano, or like in a when a big concert venue starts, you hear all the instrumentalists tuning their instrument. Usually that's the la they use, 440 cycles per second. Now if you push then the la on a keyboard on a particular in a particular octave, and you do that on the next octave, there's a relationship between those two. That's why it sort of sounds the same but higher or lower, because higher the ratio doubles,
Mhm.
lower the ratio is in half, and you can build that out in both directions. So there is an element of fixed ratios, so to speak, in correspondence. But again, one word can be used for another in daily language, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes really towards, the methodology of actual study. So when we say study, what do we mean? So you're reading some passages, you're going through a text like the Secret Doctrine, as example. And one of the things that you're doing is you're constantly looking for and identifying analogies and correspondences between different things, because the reality of something on a higher plane and the reality of that same thing as it manifests on this plane is going to have some kind of connection and similarity. So you're, in a certain sense, what you're doing is you're learning to get a bit of a foothold onto understanding things that are beyond our current scope by understanding the correspondence or analogy between those higher things and the things that are available for us to
Yeah.
investigate. So it's a way of elevating. It's a way of like taking a step up. It doesn't mean you have direct knowledge of those higher things yet. You don't necessarily have direct contact, but you can start to get a bit of a mental map of those things by corresponding to things that are in your range.
You could say you have direct knowledge of it, but on this plane.
On this plane.
Not on
Yeah,
the plane where it's applicable, but you see relationships. And
exactly.
that is actually also part of unity. Eh? What is unity? Well, in its manifested condition, it's nothing else but a bunch of relationships. And it is inquiring into these relationships, the how and why, the purpose of things, the functionality of things, where you realize that unity is truly a fact in nature. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also, besides correspondence and analogy, there is also a very specific reference that HPB gives. It's in volume 1 of the Seeker Doctrine on pages 20 and 21, where she refers to an abstract formula. And as far as I know, it's the only place in the Seeker Doctrine where she repeats the same thing 3 times in one paragraph. That means pay attention here. And it's very early in the Seeker Doctrine, 2021. And she gives one example of that at the close to the very bottom of 21, where she says the term monad can be applied to an atom, to a planet, to a human being, to a solar system, and beyond. And that is actually the application of that abstract formula. Now, if you say, okay, can you give a rational explanation of that formula? No, I can't. I can give some examples, but I also don't know everything about that formula. There may be applications of it that we have totally not even thought about.
Mm-hmm.
But context is also an element of that. And of course, analogy and correspondence also falls under that abstract formula. But there are many other elements that we need to take into account in the methodology that we develop for ourselves. There are elements that are the same for everybody, of course, but there may be specific things that only apply to yourself because of your mental and psychological and spiritual makeup, even.
Exactly. And that goes back to the self-devised, self-induced efforts idea. We're devising our own methodology. We're devising and we're inducing our own practice. So the formula that you bring up there and how it ties in with analogy and correspondence and other aspects of it, symbology plays a role in that as well. It starts to become a kind of intuitive toolbox almost. And this is why it's hard to describe. You and I have talked before about sort of how to describe that formula or that methodology, because in a certain sense it's a little it's meta rational, you could say, right? It's not just a purely ABC kind of mental approach. You're not just making like straightforward equations. Well, this matches with this, so therefore this is this. It's not like that. It's a kind of intuitive method of approaching topics and ideas. And it's something that you start with things like analogy and correspondence as a practice, looking for those, learning how to identify them, how those correspondences and analogies map out onto on a subject, and you gradually move towards this sort of meta formula, this sort of method approach to what study is.
Yeah.
And just speaking
But
from my own experience, it's a little bit
yeah.
like something clicks in and you just start seeing things a certain way that you hadn't seen before, seeing connections
Yeah.
that you can't quite nail
It's in
down.
a sense a new way of looking at things that transcends the common ratio. But that doesn't mean that you have to drop rationality or logic, or the intellect. Sometimes people look a little bit down upon intellect, but if you can't read or write, there's no purpose in even getting started, of course, because the material that we investigate is primarily represented in a literature. And that reminds me, by the way, of that beautiful Christian perspective on study, the Lectio Divina, divine reading, or Lectio Sacra, also sacred reading of things. And that is even more than just reading between the lines. It's like reading behind the words to a depth that is not a part of your rational understanding. And then you end up again with an intuitive understanding of things.
Mhm.
But you can, how do you develop intuition? Well, it just strikes you, but you discover it in the preparation of the soil by knowing which soil, how to prepare, what seeds to put in there, that eventually you start building a concept of how intuition can be triggered, so to speak.
Mhm.
Right?
That's a great
And
way
of
to
course,
put it.
there's always people say, yeah, but you guys are always with your concepts. I don't believe in concepts. Well, that's a concept too. so, so there's
Yeah.
no need to criticize. And HPP says it in the Secret Doctrine. It's very early, could be page 7 or so in the first fundamental, where she mentions in a footnote, we reserve the right as conceptualists, and then she goes on and on.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's our level of investigation, to conceptualize and, how would you call that? Like squeeze everything out of it that is possible. And then you come to to the paradox or to an intuitive insight, but you got to learn to fly, you know?
And that's an important thing with the conceptualization, is that the concept isn't the end goal, but it is a step, a necessary stepping
Yeah.
stone. And that's where
Yeah.
we kind of, Theosophy differs from the point of view of some traditions on conceptualization. So
Yeah.
if we shift sort of to the other side, we brought up we brought up ethics, and then we kind of went into study. One of the other sides, and one of the main things that people are going to ask the moment they get in touch with Theosophy and start thinking about practical application, is something like meditation. So one of I want to start off with one thing that threads its way if you read through The Voice of the Silence, which is Blavatsky's sort of principal, practical, metaphysical text. One of the things that threads its way all the way through that is the distinction between higher and lower within us. And that's just a way of phrasing the makeup of a human being into sort of higher qualities, lower qualities. In a sense, there's an analogy between that and the way scientists would think of prefrontal cortex versus lizard brain or whatever else we want to call it, right? There's a sort of lower impulses and higher thinking. In Theosophy, there's that same concept. So one of the things I thought we could touch on is, in The Voice of the Silence, one of the things that's touched on is like necessary preliminaries. First, we have that shift in mindset towards universal brotherhood, altruism, all of that. And then we have, how do we deal with the lower parts of ourselves, with the more animalistic, survival instinct driven kind of impulses? And that threads its way through the Voice of the Silence as a kind of preliminary training. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit to outline that before we talk about anything more meditation related.
Well, yeah, of course, there is a whole range of requisites, but you could say fundamentally they come down to the point that we have to learn to control our desires. But we also have to learn to still our mind, because since that operates in the rational realm, and that is a study tool, but at some point you need to transcend that. And what is the transcending then? Well, that's quieting the mind. Make it like an empty cup, so to speak, so that the light from above, by, by like of a, by prof- trying to not to go too deep in what that light may represent, that that gets a chance to manifest itself, and that is that what you can call intuition, or that becomes of a more permanent nature, like we said before. And yeah, that's the fundamental idea, is control your desires and put the mind at rest. Not permanently, of course. You need to live in the world. If you go shopping, use your mind. But
Mm-hmm.
there are specific times that we can reserve to pay a lot more attention to that, especially to the ethical control of our desires, of course. That could become a permanent feature in our life, but it's not easy to do, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Our likes and dislikes, that's for most part of the day.
It drives most of our decision making, and most of our
Yeah,
impulses are
it's all good to say self-induced and self-devised efforts. Yeah, but you got to leave your likes and dislikes behind in order to be able to do that, because it's
Mhm.
all memory.
Yeah. I like to think of it in a sense of the goal in that kind of practice, which you'll find as preliminary practices in everything. Like Yoga Sutras has the same kind of, we got these preliminary
Of
practices
course.
to deal with the lower.
Yeah.
I like to think of it in terms of sort of right orientation. And theosophically, there's a way of looking at that when we start to understand the principles of human beings, sort of a bit more complex view of what a human being is. Then we can think of orientation as our higher principles, so the higher functioning parts of ourselves, the more universal parts of ourselves, uh, ought to be over top of the lower, more like individualistic kind of impulses. And in our society, that's often reversed, where we put the individualization of ourselves or the
Yeah.
personal self in the primary place. My personal needs are the most important thing. So Theosophy really has this point of view that you need to orient yourself properly. And that means that the higher parts of yourselves ought to be, in a certain sense, kind of ruling over the lower parts of yourself, which are subservient, because they're still tools. Desire is a valuable tool, intellect is a valuable tool. But if they're the thing that leads, you go straight down that road to hell that's paved with all the good intentions, right?
Yeah. All
So
right.
you want to orient yourself properly. I think that's primary. And one of the things that comes up is the moment you make a goal, the moment you say, I'm going to try to be more universal, I'm going to try to be more altruistic, I'm going to really dig into study, all kinds of your lower stuff is going to come up and say, I would rather sit on the couch and drink a beer and watch TV. I would rather do, like there's 1,000 things that are going to come up. So you're immediately faced with all those lower impulses. So it makes sense that the preliminary practices are, got to get a handle on those.
Yeah. Yeah. The level of excuses is uncountable almost. You can always come
Absolutely.
up with an excuse, but yeah, you have to make a start with it. And Theosophy doesn't say, okay, once you start walking that path, but by the time you die, you got to get it all under your belt. And of course, that brings up the subject of karma and reincarnation, which is something that will be discussed next time, I think. So you have to do what you can. And like those Mahatmas say, those teachers say, try, ever keep trying. Your progress is not determined by reaching a goal or goals. It's determined by the efforts that you make. And if you fall, no problem. Just make sure you can get up again and start again. And it's going to take lifetimes,
Mm-hmm.
maybe one lifetime, maybe 50, maybe 500, maybe 1,000. Who knows? That depends on where you are positioned in your development, of course. But sooner or later, everybody in the world will have to go that path. There's no way around it, or it's the road to perdition. That's the alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the effort is really, it's really important to have that laid out at the beginning, because when we say self-devised efforts, we really do mean effort. Like, it's going to be an effort. The analogies that are often used throughout theosophical literature and many other traditions, they'll either put it in like a war context, like the Bhagavad Gita. You got to defeat thousands of your own enemies that are actually in your own mind, in your own self, all of these things. Maybe the analogy is used of like climbing a mountain, like you got to climb Mount Everest. Well, it's not an easy thing. None of these are easy things to do. They're hard because we have all of these lower parts of ourselves unrestrained and running rampant right now. So to get all of that under control is a big process, and it has to do with that whole evolutionary process of involution and evolution. It's a necessary part of a bigger picture. It's not like we got here by screwing up, you know? It's not like we're incarnated as human beings because somehow we missed the mark and we went the wrong way. It's like all of this is part of the process. So all the challenges we face, all the stuff that's in ourselves that make walking the path difficult is built into the nature of the path. It's unavoidable. Like she says, obligatory pilgrimage. There's no avoiding it. This is reality. Yeah.
And there, why do we war among each other? Because we refuse to take on the war within ourselves, which is what the whole Bhagavad Gita is basically about. So instead of spending your whole day in going outward, which ultimately at some point here or there will lead to friction with others, we have to take on the friction that exists within ourselves, because everyone is fighting sometimes with elements of a moral nature. How shall I do it, or shall I just forget about it? And that causes friction in us. By the way, those frictions then are leading ultimately to the limited understanding of certain teachings. Right? They form the heavyweight that keeps us from the how you call that, the chain ball or ball chain or
Yeah.
something
Yeah,
on your
exactly.
foot. Yeah, and it's self produced. So, and there is also that element of sacrifice. But what does it mean to sacrifice? It may fundamentally means to make sacred. So sacrifice is not that the lower has to be slaughtered like in a slaughterhouse. It has to be actually that what there is a need for an alchemical purification, because the substances that now form our limitations, it's not that they have to be thrown away, they have to be changed into something better. You could say it's like an education of substance. And those substances are very often referred to as elementals, which consist of many degrees, and that's a subject that we can discuss later. But the problems that we encounter within ourselves of a psychological nature have a substance colored by ourselves, which becomes our memory, which is made up of those elementals. You could say psychic centers of force, Mr. Judge calls them. And we color those psychic centers. They don't do anything by themselves. They sit there like a recorder, so to speak. But then they reflect back what we put into it. They are outside of ourselves, but they're also inside ourselves, because the whole investigation of the what was the word again that we used? The tattva jnani is the investigation of elemental substances. That makes up the gunas, the substance of which the whole world is made up, from a spiritual level, psychic, astral, and physical, or substantial. And that investigation is what we need to learn to do in ourselves by going within instead of without.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very long process, of course.
Which really makes clear why, those early preliminary practices have so much to do with kind of clarification, purification, whether the words you want to use for it. So we have all of these things in ourselves that need to be just sort of, I like the clean your room idea that's very popular these days. It's like we have to clean and organize ourselves. We have to clean and organize all the parts of ourselves. All those parts, like you say, are substantial. So there is an actual act of cleaning ourselves up,
but it's
and
not
orienting.
a chemical cleaning. It's not a chemical cleaning. It's an alchemical cleaning.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so let's go from there to, I think there's maybe two more points that I'd like us to hit on. One is I just want to ask a question, and then we'll see where we go with the answer to it, because this is the question that gets asked all the time when you start talking about practical theosophy. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm interested in theosophy, how do I meditate? How do we answer that question?
Well, that's one of the most difficult questions to answer because it depends on what you mean then by meditation. Um, what's the other word again that's very often used? Contemplation. Sometimes they are um, mixed up. Sometimes they are seen as different things. And so, first of all, we need a little bit of a definition of meditation. And the most simple definition would be to go within. But the application of it is also to go without. So, because the insights that we eventually acquire through meditation by going within need to be applied to the outward world. And that will then respond to the strength of our being. And then we need to go back within and investigate it again. So, yeah, it's a very difficult point because one of the elements that are given, and that's also a very broad subject, is that, for instance, and that's also a Pythagorean injunction. That is, okay, you live your life through the day, all kinds of stuff happens, good, bad. Then you go to bed, and that is when you go to bed, is to look back on your day in the reverse. It is said that ultimately it will even reduce your incarnations. Because the reason why we have incarnations is because we set causes in motion, the resolution of which cannot take place in this life. Where else would it happen then? Well, in future lives. If the actions that we set in motion, especially on a mental plane, are so idealistic, they will never find a way out on this plane. So Theosophy teaches there is a plane after we die where those ideations will have their resolve. But then again, it leads to reincarnation. So ultimately, although reincarnation is one of our favorite subjects, it's something you got to get rid of it as soon as possible,
Hmm.
but it's not going to happen because you want to get rid of it. You have to set causes in motion that eventually reduces the reincarnations so that you come to a point where either you go up in nirvana or you decide to stay on and work for humanity, those nirmanakayas again. So, yeah, meditation is a very difficult subject. If you want a very practical but not easy answer to it, I would say go to the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali. If you look in Mr. Judge rendition, you go to page 7 and you look at verse 17, he points out all the meditative practices that follow the rest of the book. Those
Hmm.
4 stages is the rest of the book, basically. The first stage is called the argumentative division. What does that consist of? Well, primarily of study. We don't often think of study as being meditation, but that's what it is. Concentration.
Hmm.
That's the first thing you need. If you can't stay with the subject, there's no point in learning, of course. So the next step is, you could call it dhyana as meditation, but it's more a contemplation of the things you have studied. And then ultimately the resolution, the solutions to what you're studying, you can also compare that with samadhi. And what is samadhi? Well, that's where everything comes together. It makes sense. It leads to an understanding. And that is actually the fundamental type of meditation that we need to learn. That is study. You know? And
Hmm.
if you want to go via Buddhist route a little bit or the Vedantic route, of course, by all means, go ahead. But you're gonna be confronted with the same things as what we refer to in theosophy, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some sort of fundamental principles in all the different meditation techniques that obviously have real world benefit and benefit on the path that theosophy lays out. And concentration as a very simple idea is fundamental that if you can't concentrate, you're not going to make progress in a lot of different things. So you're not going to make progress in your study. So concentration underlies jnana yoga as well. But the ability to hold the mind on something is of primary importance. So, you know, in a lot of systems, like especially in the more elaborate Buddhist systems, you've got all kinds of different things that you're doing in your meditation. They may be visualizations, there may be all kinds of other practices, there may be chanting of mantras in some systems, and so on, right? But in all of them, if we just want to at least get like the starting point of what we could refer to as like meditation practice, take concentration up. Can you sustain concentration? And it is way harder than people think it is. When you sit and you try to hold your mind on one thing, you're immediately confronted with how volatile your own mind is. And so I always think that placing that idea at the forefront is a really good starting point for people.
Yeah. It's almost so that sometimes we concentrate more subconsciously than consciously. But that's the problem. When you do it consciously, the mind has a tendency to go in 10,000 directions. Now, I think a major mistake in thinking about meditation is to think that you have to meditate about one specific thing or object. HPB even says that if you absolutely can concentrate, start with a candle. She means that metaphorically, of course, because the thing is to learn to focus, but that doesn't mean that it has to be on a single object. It can be a subject, but then can you stay with the subject? It doesn't mean that your mind is not working anymore. In the early stages of meditation, that argumentative division is where you measure things against each other. You try to figure things out. You need focus for that, concentration, dharana. So yeah, that is meditation also. And also our behavior pattern in terms of ethics will throw up limitations and borders. So meditation is also going out in the world and doing the right thing, so to speak, because that will have an effect on your ability to concentrate and penetrate deeper into realms that may be totally unknown to you at
Yeah.
present. But also don't think that seeing things there, oh, yeah, I see entities or something like that. That's not meditation, you know what? That, and some people even think that they see God then. And all of those are illusions, because ultimately you need to come to that point of a non-dual understanding of things. And that's a very long road. They're called samprajnatas and asamprajnatas in Patanjali. So it's a very long road meditation, and easy. It's easily given up, you know,
Yeah,
because the
exactly.
effort is so big, you know.
One of the things I really like that you kind of touched on through there is um, a phrasing that comes from William Quan Judge, which is the life's meditation, your life's
Life's
meditation.
meditation.
So you
Yeah.
have, in theosophy, theosophists in general kind of look at it in meditation in kind of two different categories. Then, in a sense, there's the meditation that you sit down and do at some set time, or there's the meditation that relates to study. I'm going to sit and I'm going to study right now. I'm going to focus and concentrate, or I'm going to work through an idea in my mind. There's all that stuff that's like particular intended practice. And then there's, where is our mind throughout the course of the entire day? So what is our mind focusing on? What is it? How is it moving through our experiences through the day? Is there stability in the mind throughout the day? Is there concentration in the mind throughout the day? So the life's meditation is something that is, in my view, a little bit more primary, because I mean, you can sit and you can meditate and be a master meditator and have an absolute train wreck of a life. That's entirely possible, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you
Yeah.
said earlier, with that reciprocal sort of, we go in with meditation, we apply outward. We go in, we apply outward. There's this constant revolving of that practice. And there's just,
Basically regurgitation,
yeah, exactly.
and
And
get
and there's
rid of the trash, you know.
yeah. And how do we meet everything that comes to us in life? Because life is going to throw stuff at us. And every time life throws stuff at us, we can't go and retreat into our room and go into meditation. So there is an importance to learning to develop your mind in a kind of stability through anything that's happening in life. And that's a huge challenge as well.
And
Yeah.
what does judge mean then by a life's meditation? Well, that's going through life in a focused, aware condition rather than going in 10,000 different directions. And, where does that lead? And of course, I know of people who do not believe in anything beyond death, and they also meditate because they learn to settle their mind and lead a better life in that sense. But of course, and that takes us back to the very beginning, from a purely materialistic point, who cares? If it makes you feel better, fine. But if if that's all you get out of it, that's kind of on the low end. Because
Yes.
yeah, go
So
ahead.
meditation, well, I was going to say meditation in Theosophy, whether it's a set period of meditation or whether we're talking about our life's meditation or whether we're talking about study as Jnana yoga, it all is in Theosophy. It's all within the context of a larger worldview. So it's the practices are. I was going to say subservient to. That's not quite the right word, but the practices sort of follow in the wake of the worldview. So you're trying to practice meditation for a particular reason. You're not just trying to meditate because it makes you feel better, or because it makes you more successful in business, or because it makes you more successful in dating or relationships, or all the different reasons people meditate, because meditation will help with all those things.
Yeah,
But in
and they can
Theosophy,
also focus. They can
yes.
also focus.
Oh, the most hardcore psychopathic businessman is usually a master at concentration and
Yeah,
focus and
yeah,
willpower and all of these things, but that doesn't mean they're on the right path in an overall sense. So we do need to have it all in subserviency to the ethical foundation, which is altruism, universal brotherhood. So everything we're doing in practice has a bigger goal in mind than just the practice. We're not studying to just
yeah,
learn the topic, right?
yeah,
We're not meditating to just feel better. All of that is in service. Go ahead.
yeah. Again, there's the purpose and meaning, and that's one of the things we brought up in our very first podcast, if I remember correctly. That's meaning. Because look at it this way: imagine that materialists are correct, and theosophy, yeah, it's wishy-washy. And imagine that it's not true theosophy. Materialism is true. Why would you be a good being? Why would you take care of people? What is wrong with being as selfish as you can? Just be an animal. Yeah, but you don't do, it's not human. Who cares? I don't care about your definition of human. I'm human too. Look, I'm being human. I'm shooting people. I'm killing people. I'm taking other people's wives. What's wrong with that? If there is only one life, you have no recourse against those comments. You may be the most brilliant moralist in the world. Yeah, but you can imagine that everybody is doing it. Well, they're not. I'm doing it. See where I'm going with that? You have no recourse against them. Yeah, but it makes life unlivable. Not for me. I mean, I wouldn't want to pay lunch to all those bastards in the world that have died peacefully in their bed, stinking rich.
Yes.
They die. We don't know what's going to happen after
Mhm.
we die. Of course, we have a philosophical backup for that has a pretty good foot on the ground. But if you don't accept that, and there is, I mean, oh my God, imagine sitting on the right hand of God and singing his praise for the rest of eternity. That must be ultimately boring. Is that all we're doing? Or hell, even worse. Oh my God. But the materialist has a point. If there is really nothing after death, you can do what you like. Just don't get caught. That's all.
Exactly. It's
There you
really
go.
interesting because, like
I
you
go
say,
for the theosophical route.
There's no shortage of pure materialists who have been cutthroat businessmen or warlords or whatever you want to call them, who have lived exactly the life they wanted to
Sure.
live and died peacefully
Yeah.
in their sleep at
Yeah.
85.
But
There's
here's
no
the thing.
shortage of that.
Here's the thing, John. Imagine that Theosophy is true. Oh my God, they're going to be in trouble, you know,
Because karma's
because
going to come.
causes have effects, you know.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we're taking the safe road here.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that
But
as a way to look at
that shouldn't
theosophy.
be the motive. That
Yeah.
shouldn't be the motive. The motive should be because you realize that we are a unit, not only with human beings, with the lower kingdoms and the higher kingdoms and everything that exists. And of course, that's a long and far stretch, but it is possible to come to certain conclusions there that are unavoidable. And then you got to live according to those perspectives, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So the bigger picture, this is what I really like about theosophy. The bigger picture, the bigger worldview is vitally important to all the practice. The practice cannot be separated from that. So if you were to take theosophical practice and do it as a materialist, you will see certain kinds of results. Definitely good concentration, good study, all that stuff. You're not going to be, that is not the same as being on the theosophical path. The theosophical path is based on that fundamental ethic of unity, right? So if you're not aiming for unity, it doesn't matter what your practice is, you're not really moving in the right direction.
And HPB points that out. That she says the most fundamental thing in everything we do is motive. And think of the word motive as motif. That's the shape of an object, like in art, they call that a motive, something, motif. Well, it has the same root as a motive, which means the shape that we give to our concepts, to our perceptions, you know, and that is crucial. So it's the shape that we give to our tendencies, to our intent of what
Mhm.
we're doing. So that there is something to say for shaping your motive.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good way
Yeah.
to go. So maybe we can kind of just end with a little bit of a summary. Let's say, okay, so if you want to be a theosophist who practices theosophy, first you're going to need to take a look at your likes and dislikes and your motives. You're going to have to an account of yourself. Where am I currently at? What am I doing? What's driving me? All that
Yeah.
stuff. You need
Curb
to
your
get
desires.
yeah. So
Curb
there's all
your
this
desires. Yeah.
exactly. So that's a real like initial preliminary, and it has to do with also investigating yourself, right? And then universal brotherhood. I mean, you're going to have to start exploring the idea of unity and what that means metaphysically, because that's going to reinforce the ethic. The metaphysics
In
is
the
going to
practice.
lead to the ethic.
Yeah.
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 Once you have that in place in your mind, you have a bit of an orientation. So you're kind of not, now you're kind of oriented to where you're going to move. And then you've got kind of these two sides of practice, then, right? You've got your study side, let's say your Jnana yoga side, and you've got your Raja yoga side. You're going to have study as a practice, the way we've discussed it, and you're going to have some kind of self-devised. Uh, I'm hesitant to use the word meditation, but some kind of like meditation-like practice. You're gonna need to work on things like concentration. You need to do, like you said, maybe end of day review where you go through your what's been going on for yourself, take stock of what's going on in your lower nature. How can you clean it up and organize it? And all of that is aimed towards orienting ourselves properly so that we become more receptive to all things higher, more receptive to the higher light within us, more receptive to the voice of conscience, to intuition, all of that.
Yeah. It's
Anything I
interesting
missed?
that you use the word orienting, metaphorically, and maybe also literally so in a certain sense. The North is usually seen, or the North Pole, as something spiritual compared to the South Pole. Well, follow your compass, you know, stay above the equator. That's
I like that.
about as the worst you can apply, but try and stay as close to the vertical line as possible. And nobody says that you have to be perfect. It's not for our time yet, but there may come a time when we reach perfection in that outlook that we generate.
Hmm.
Practice makes perfect, right? That's true for theosophy as well.
Exactly. And all of these practices in theosophy are, in a sense, preliminary to something that is kind of a mystery. There's something that we use placeholder words like initiation and adeptship and Mahatmas and Nirmanakayas and Bodhisattvas and all these terms. We use these terms for something that we cannot claim to really fully understand. But there's all these preliminary practices, which is the bulk of what theosophy promotes, that are meant to prepare one for something that we can kind of get our little glimpses of, but maybe
Yeah.
not fully understand.
One of my a mentor of mine when I was still living in Europe, he said, if you would know from the very beginning what the ultimate result would be, not so much goal, but result, he said, you would do nothing in your life than chasing it for the rest of the day. But you don't know because that is part of the investigation. Like, where does it lead to in the end? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there we
And
go.
we have all of our little stuff, all of our lower stuff screaming at us to go in 100 different directions. So
Yeah,
it's
right.
going to take time to be
Yeah.
always oriented, right?
Yeah.
All right.
So
Anything in
the best
conclusion?
advice is in life, either become a criminal or become a theosophist. It's as simple as that. That's a joke, of course.
There's no better way to end a podcast.